What would you do if your own son, the one you raised, the one you'd die for, pushed you off a cliff and left you to die in the freezing mountains of Montana, in the silent wilderness where snow buries both footprints and sins? One old war veteran lies broken and alone, except for a dog who refuses to let him go. Scout, his aging German shepherd, runs through the storm, through ice and fear, to bring help before it's too late. But this isn't just a story of survival. It's about forgiveness, grace, and how God sometimes sends miracles, not from heaven, but through love, loyalty, and second chances. Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The morning mist clung low over the Bitterroot Mountains, soft and silver like the breath of something ancient. Pine needles whispered as an old man's wheelchair creaked up the dirt path. Harold Bennett, 70 years old, moved slowly, his lined hands gripping the worn armrests of the chair that had become both his prison and his chariot. His eyes, a steel gray dulled by time yet sharp with memory, scanned the ridgeline ahead. The mountain had not changed, though he had. Once he had climbed it with the ease of youth, boots muddy, rifle slung across a strong back, lungs full of war's adrenaline and fear. Now, every inch forward was a negotiation with pain. His legs, twisted and unresponsive, had given up decades ago after the shrapnel tore through them during the Tet Offensive of 1968. But his spirit, scarred, stubborn, and unwilling to yield, remained intact. He wore a thick brown flannel jacket that had lost its color to years of Montana wind, and a wool cap that clung to what little silver hair he had left. His face, carved deep with lines of endurance, bore the soft shadow of a man who had seen too much to fear anything anymore. Behind him walked his son, Evan Bennett, 41, tall, lean, with a square jaw and eyes too restless to ever meet another's gaze for long. He had inherited Harold's frame, but none of his patience. His dark hair was slicked back neatly, but the crease in his forehead betrayed the pressure he lived under. A pressure self-made, born from debts, failed ventures, and the gnawing frustration of a man who thought life owed him more. The father's quiet dignity was something Evan both envied and despised. "You're doing good, Dad," he said, voice tight with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Almost there." Harold grunted in response. The wind caught the edges of their conversation, twisting it into something hollow. They were climbing toward Widow's Rise, a narrow overlook known for its breathtaking view of the valley below. Harold had not been there since before his injury, back when his wife Margaret was still alive, and laughter filled the cabin. Now silence filled it instead. Silence and the steady company of a German shepherd named Scout. Scout was 8 years old, his once black coat now streaked with silver. He was large, muscular but graceful, the kind of dog that moved like water and watched like a soldier. His ears pricked at every shift in the wind. The left one bore a thin scar from his K-9 service days when he'd been trained to detect explosives for local search and rescue units. To Harold, Scout was more than a companion. He was the last living remnant of a time when loyalty still meant something. Scout followed close behind, his amber eyes flicking between the two men. He sensed tension. Dogs always did. The scent of unease lingered heavier than the pine. Evan's movements were clipped, impatient, his hands clenched and unclenched on the wheelchair handles as though the simple act of pushing his father was a burden. "Didn't think I'd be up here again," Harold murmured, breaking the silence. His voice rasped like gravel but carried warmth. "Your mother loved this view." Evan's lips twitched. "Yeah, I remember. You two used to bring me here." She'd make those peanut butter sandwiches. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. You loved her more than anyone, didn't you? Harold turned his head slowly, sensing the bitterness coiled beneath the question. I loved you both, son, but love isn't a competition. Evan said nothing. The wheels rolled over loose stones that crunched beneath them. To their right, the drop began, sharp and deep, with mist swirling below like ghostly water. Harold could smell the storm coming. He always could. The scent of ozone hung faint in the air. The same smell had lingered in Da Nang the day the shell hit his unit. He still dreamed of that sound. The hollow boom, the scream, the light. He sometimes wondered if he'd really come home that day, or if part of him was still lying somewhere in the jungle, half buried and forgotten. Evan's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts ran numbers, unpaid bills, a pending foreclosure, a credit card he'd maxed to cover another lie. His father's pension and the property deed, those were the golden tickets. He had found the legal papers weeks ago, realized his name wasn't on any of them. Dad, he said suddenly, what happens to the place when you're gone? Harold's hands froze on the chair's armrests. Why are you asking me that? Just curious. You're not getting younger. Evan smiled thinly. Might as well plan ahead. The land stays in the family, Harold said simply. But I haven't decided who'll take care of it. Not decided? Evan's tone sharpened. Who else is there? Harold looked up at him. That depends on who earns it. The words were quiet, but struck harder than any bullet. They reached the clearing. The valley unfolded before them, green fading into blue mist, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds. Harold's breath caught. Still beautiful, he whispered. Evan nodded absently, jaw tightening. He looked down at his father, frail, half-broken but serene. Something inside him twisted. Maybe it was shame, maybe anger, maybe both. He crouched behind the chair, hands tightening on the grips. You ever think about what comes after? He asked softly. After all the fighting? After the pain? Harold smiled faintly. There's always something after, son. God sees to that. Yeah, Evan said, voice hollow. Guess we'll find out. The push was subtle, almost gentle, a single motion, a flicker of hesitation drowned by desperation. The gravel slipped, the chair tilted. Harold gasped, not from fear, but disbelief. For a moment he saw his son's face above him, eyes wide, wet, and empty. Then he fell. The air tore from his lungs as the world spun. He hit an outcrop, metal shrieking, pain exploding through his ribs. The chair caught between two rocks, dangling him above the void. He tried to shout, but only blood answered. Above, Scout barked, once, twice, then broke into a full sprint. Evan froze. The dog's growl cut through the air, primal and thunderous. Scout, stay back! Evan shouted, but the shepherd lunged, forcing him to step away from the cliff. The animal's barks echoed into the valley as if summoning judgment itself. Somewhere below, Harold hung between life and sky, his eyes half closed, breath shallow. In the dizzying silence between heartbeats, a thought flickered through him. Not anger, not fear, but sorrow. Not for himself, but for what his son had become. He whispered into the wind, unsure if anyone could hear. God, help him. He's lost. Then the pain consumed him. Scout's barking grew frantic. The sound carried through the forest until it reached the distant cabin of Clara Hughes, 68, a retired Army medic who lived alone since her husband's passing. Her hearing wasn't what it once was, but she knew that bark. It was Scout's, Harold's dog. Something was wrong. She set down her teacup, grabbed her raincoat, and stepped into the cold. Far above, the clouds began to close, sealing the ridge in a curtain of gray. The mountain exhaled, as if the earth itself mourned. On Widow's Rise, a son walked away with shaking hands, and a dog cried out for a man who still clung to life by inches and faith. Rain came slowly at first, tapping on pine needles like a warning. Then it fell harder, slicing through the fog that veiled Widow's Rise. The air grew heavy, the mountain breathing in the storm. Beneath that breath, Harold Bennett hung between two jagged stones, his wheelchair wedged precariously, one wheel spinning uselessly in the wind. Pain pulsed through his ribs and spine like an electric current. He tried to move, but his right arm refused to obey, and blood trickled down his temple, warm against the cold air. The echo of his son's voice, shaken, guilty, distant, faded into the hiss of the rain. "Evan," he croaked, but no one answered. Only the storm did, roaring back with indifference. Above, Scout barked wildly, pacing the cliff's edge, his paws slipping on wet gravel. His fur was soaked to the skin, darkened to near black, but his eyes gleamed with fierce resolve. The smell of blood, metal, and fear mixed in the wind, and Scout recognized the scent. His master was alive, but fading. The dog's instincts, honed from years of search and rescue training, ignited with purpose. He barked again, loud and sharp, the kind of bark that carried far beyond the valley. Then, as if guided by memory, he turned and sprinted down the path. His paws splashed through puddles, claws scraping the mud as thunder rolled across the ridgeline. A mile below, in a modest cabin tucked between two fir trees, Clara Hughes was setting a kettle onto her old iron stove when she heard the barking. It cut through the rain like a distress call. Clara, now 68, had the air of someone who'd lived two lives. The young, fearless medic who once pulled soldiers from rubble, and the older woman who carried their ghosts. Her short silver hair was tied loosely at the back, and deep lines framed her steady brown eyes. She wore an olive-green field jacket faded at the shoulders, relic of her army years. Her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but she recognized Scout's bark instantly. "Oh, God," she muttered, grabbing her raincoat. Scout appeared moments later, bursting through the tree line, his chest heaving. Mud splattered his legs, and his left paw was bleeding from a sharp rock. He ran straight to Clara's porch, barking and then darting toward the trail, back and forth, as if begging her to follow. "All right, I'm coming," she said, voice trembling. She snatched a flashlight, a coil of rope, and an old canvas medical bag that still carried the faint scent of iodine and leather. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Clara followed Scout up the slick path. The rain made the earth soft, slippery, and each step reminded her that she wasn't the soldier she once was. Her knees ached, but she pressed on, driven by the desperate cries echoing through the pines. Scout would run ahead, stop, bark, then glance back at her to make sure she followed. His fur glistened under the flashes of lightning, and his loyalty burned like a torch in the storm. By the time they reached Widow's Rise, the world had turned gray and violent. Clara shone her flashlight across the edge, her heart catching when she saw the twisted glint of metal below. "Harold!" she shouted. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint reply rose through the wind. "Down here!" His voice was hoarse, fragile but alive. Clara's throat tightened. She dropped to her knees, scanning the cliff for a safe route. There was none. The rocks were slick, the drop steep. But she'd faced worse in jungles far from here. She tied the rope around a pine trunk, testing its hold twice, then looped the other end around her waist. Scout whined beside her, his breath fogging the air. "Stay," she commanded softly, though she knew he wouldn't. With slow precision, Clara began her descent, boots scraping stone, rain stinging her face. The flashlight beam flickered down the slick rock until it caught on Harold's figure. He was slumped forward, one arm dangling, his face pale as ash. When she reached him, Clara's chest tightened. The years had changed him. His once square shoulders now frail, his beard unkempt, silver overtaking brown. But his eyes were still the same. "Clara," he rasped. "You look like hell," she said, half laughing, half crying. "So do you," he managed, voice cracked. She examined his wounds quickly. Fractured ribs, likely internal bruising, a head laceration, but he was breathing and conscious. "You always did fall for the dramatic entrances," she said, looping a sling under his arms. Above them, Scout barked and paced, whining each time the rope shifted. Clara braced her boots and pulled, the rain washing over her face, mixing with tears she didn't notice. Harold groaned but didn't protest. Every pull was agony for both of them, but inch by inch, they moved upward. Lightning cracked, and the forest lit up in white fire for an instant, an image of two old soldiers defying time and nature. When they finally reached the top, Clara collapsed beside him, gasping. Scout immediately rushed in, licking Harold's face and pressing his head against his chest. "Good boy," Harold whispered weakly, his fingers trembling as they brushed the dog's wet fur. Clara rested a hand on the shepherd's neck, feeling his heartbeat thrum strong and wild beneath her palm. "He saved you," she said softly. Harold nodded faintly. "He always does." She helped him sit upright, covering him with her raincoat. "We need to get you to town," she said. "Can you hold on?" "Long enough," he murmured. His gaze drifted toward the valley, where faint lights flickered below. "Did you see him?" Clara hesitated. "Evan? No, should I have?" Harold's lips trembled. "He was here. He stopped, eyes closing as exhaustion overtook him. Clara frowned, but there'd be time for questions later. She wrapped him in her emergency blanket, then tied the rope around both their waists again. "Scout! Heel!" she called, and the dog fell into step beside her, pressing close to Harold's side as if afraid the man might vanish if he didn't touch him. Step by step, the three of them made their way down the slippery slope. By the time they reached the tree line, dawn had begun to bleed into the clouds, painting the rain with hints of gold. The storm was breaking, but the truth was only beginning to rise. In the valley below, Evan Bennett sat inside his truck, parked near the highway turnoff. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel. The windshield was streaked with rain, and his reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning. He kept telling himself it was over, that no one saw, no one knew, but guilt had a voice louder than reason. It whispered from the storm. It barked from the distance. It sounded a lot like Scout. As Clara's old pickup rolled down the muddy road hours later, Harold unconscious in the back seat, Scout's head rested on his master's lap. His eyes were half closed, but his body remained tense, guarding even in rest. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel tight. She wasn't just driving toward the hospital. She was driving into something she didn't yet understand, something dark. She glanced once at Harold through the rearview mirror and whispered, "Hold on, soldier. The fight's not done." The rain had eased by the time Clara Hughes's truck rattled into Helena General Hospital, its headlights cutting through the fading storm. The wipers screeched once before stopping, and silence took hold. That strange, suspended quiet that always follows chaos. Clara's hands were stiff on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She could feel the weight of the night pressing on her chest. In the rear seat, Harold Bennett lay pale and still beneath the damp blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. Scout, soaked and trembling, sat beside him, his amber eyes darting to every movement outside as though guarding the man from unseen threats. The dog's loyalty was no longer instinct. It was devotion carved into his bones. Inside the emergency bay, Dr. Mason Caldwell, a man in his early 50s with a sturdy build and the tired posture of someone who had seen too many long nights, met them at the door. His graying beard and crow's feet framed a face both stern and kind, the kind of man who commanded respect with quiet authority. Mason had served 2 tours as a combat medic before turning to civilian medicine, and when he saw Clara step out of the truck, their eyes met in recognition that only veterans share. "You haven't aged a day," he said with a weary half-smile. "You're a terrible liar," Clara replied. Together, they lifted Harold onto a stretcher, Scout following close until a nurse tried to stop him. The German shepherd growled low, not aggressive, but warning. "It's all right," Clara said, resting a hand on the dog's head. "He won't leave." Mason nodded to the nurse. "Let him stay." Hours blurred under fluorescent lights. Monitors beeped steadily. IV lines dripped like clockwork, and the smell of antiseptic filled the corridors. Clara sat in a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, her soaked jacket folded neatly across her lap. Mason stood across from her, reviewing the scans on a dim monitor. "He's lucky," he said finally. "Broken ribs, mild concussion, but no spinal damage beyond what was already there. If he'd fallen 2 feet further—" "He didn't," Clara interrupted softly, "because Scout called me." Mason glanced at the dog curled near the bed. "Hell of a dog," he said. When Harold finally stirred, the first thing he saw was light, the sterile glow of the hospital ceiling. Then Clara's face came into focus, tired but smiling faintly. "Welcome back," she said. Harold blinked slowly, voice barely a whisper. "How long?" "Since last night." "You've been in and out," she said. "You're safe." He exhaled, eyes closing for a moment as the memory flooded back. "Evan," he muttered. Clara frowned. "What about him?" Harold's voice cracked like a broken hinge. "He pushed me." The words hung between them, heavy and cold. Mason, who had quietly re-entered the room, froze mid-step. Clara's heart dropped. She wanted to disbelieve it. The thought of a son turning on his father. But she had seen too much of human weakness to deny what pain revealed. Later that morning, Detective Nora Kincaid from Helena PD arrived to take a statement. Nora was in her late 40s, tall and deliberate in every movement, with sharp gray eyes and cropped brown hair streaked with silver. Her trench coat was still damp from the rain, and her badge glinted faintly under the hallway light. She had a reputation for patience, the kind that unnerved liars. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a calm voice. "Mr. Bennett, I understand you've been through quite an ordeal," she began, pulling up a chair. "I just need to clarify what happened." Harold studied her face for a moment, gauging the tone of her professionalism, then nodded. "My son took me up Widow's Rise," he said. "Said he wanted to see the sunrise. Then he asked about my will." His voice trembled, shame and disbelief twisting together. "I didn't think anything of it until I felt the chair move. I turned, and he let go." Clara clenched her hands. Nora's expression didn't change, but her pen slowed. "You're certain?" "As certain as I've ever been," Harold said. "He wanted the land, the pension, everything." Scout stirred then, lifting his head and watching Nora with silent suspicion. "And this is your service dog?" she asked. "He's more than that," Harold said quietly. "He's family." By noon, Nora had already dispatched a patrol to check Widow's Rise. The report came back with photographs of tire tracks matching a dark pickup, Evan's truck, and drag marks consistent with a wheelchair's wheels near the edge. There was no sign of accident. The tracks went straight to the cliff, not away. Meanwhile, across town, Evan Bennett sat at a bar called the Silver Lantern, hunched over a whiskey he hadn't touched. The neon sign outside flickered against his face, casting restless shadows. His shirt was damp from rain, his knuckles red from gripping the glass. Evan looked younger than 41 in that moment, not by vitality, but by fear. His reflection in the mirror behind the bar looked back at him like a stranger. "Rough night?" the bartender asked. Evan glanced up. The man was in his 30s, balding with kind eyes, the kind who didn't pry. "Yeah," Evan muttered. "You could say that." He slid a few crumpled bills across the counter and stood, his legs unsteady. When he stepped outside, the morning sun had broken through, but it felt too bright, too revealing. Back at the hospital, Mason and Clara stood outside Harold's room while Nora took his formal statement. Clara's mind churned, part disbelief, part fierce protectiveness. "He raised that boy alone after Margaret died," she said quietly. "You think a man survives war just to be killed by his own blood?" Mason sighed. "War doesn't end when the shooting stops, Clara. Sometimes it just moves home." By evening, the hospital grew quiet. Harold dozed, the steady rhythm of his breathing blending with the hum of machines. Scout remained at his feet, ears twitching even in sleep. Clara sat by the window, watching the last threads of daylight fade. She couldn't shake the image of Evan's face, the bitterness Harold had described. "He pushed me." The words replayed again and again. Far away, Evan drove aimlessly down the mountain road, the guilt sitting heavy in his chest like a stone. Every bark he'd heard that night echoed in his mind. He turned the radio up, trying to drown it out, but it didn't help. When the first police cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. The lights flared red and blue against the trees. He didn't try to run. He simply pulled over, his eyes wet and empty, as if he'd known this was always where the road would end. At Helena General, Clara woke from a light doze as Mason entered. "They've brought him in," he said softly. Harold's eyes opened. "Evan?" Mason nodded. "Detective Kincaid's questioning him now." Harold turned his head slowly toward the window where the night sky shimmered faintly with leftover rain. His hand reached down, finding Scout's fur. "He's still my son," he whispered. Clara's eyes welled, but she said nothing. Sometimes forgiveness hurt more than betrayal. The first snow of the season came early to Helena that year, blanketing the hills in quiet silver. Outside the hospital window, flakes drifted slowly past the glass like ash from a gentler war. Harold Bennett watched them fall with weary eyes, his breath fogging the pain. His hands, still bandaged, trembled slightly as he reached to stroke Scout's fur. The German shepherd lay curled at his feet, half asleep but alert, tail twitching whenever the hallway door clicked. For 3 days, Harold had refused painkillers stronger than aspirin. He said they dulled the part of him that still needed to feel. Detective Nora Kincaid entered the room quietly, her coat damp from the snow. "Mr. Bennett?" she greeted. They've transferred your son to county holding until the hearing. Harold didn't turn from the window. He's talking? Somewhat, Nora said, setting her notepad down. He's admitted to arguing with you but denies intent. Claims it was an accident. Her voice softened. You're certain you want to testify? Harold's lips curved faintly, a smile without warmth. I've testified in worse rooms, Detective. But I'll speak the truth. Clara Hughes arrived soon after, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed against the sterile air. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her short gray hair was tucked beneath a wool cap. She had traded her army jacket for a beige coat too big for her, but her bearing was still straight as ever. You look better, she said, handing him a cup. You lie worse than Mason, Harold replied, though the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Clara sat, her eyes flicking to Nora before settling back on Harold. They'll ask you about the will, she said. Be ready. He nodded. I am. Then, after a pause, he was my boy, Clara. I don't know when he stopped being that. Later that morning, Nora stood by the nurse's station with Officer Liam Carter, a young patrolman in his late 20s. Liam was broad-shouldered and clean-cut, with the calm, methodical air of someone who wanted to do everything by the book. His dark blue eyes carried both respect and naivety, the kind that had not yet been tested by tragedy. He reminds me of my dad, Liam said quietly, nodding toward Harold's room. Mine served too. Korea. Nora glanced at him. Then you know what comes with it. Guilt, loyalty, and ghosts that don't rest easy. Liam nodded solemnly. At the county jail, Evan Bennett sat alone in a gray-walled interrogation room. He looked smaller now, not in size but in spirit. His once neat hair was unkempt, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When Nora entered, he didn't look up. You've been quiet, she said, pulling out a chair. That's rare for a man who claims innocence. Evan's jaw tightened. You wouldn't understand. Nora leaned back, folding her arms. Try me. His voice cracked. I didn't mean to kill him. I just snapped. He always made me feel like I was still that useless kid who couldn't live up to anything. I thought if I could take control of something, anything, maybe I'd stop feeling small. He rubbed his face with shaking hands. But when I saw him fall, I realized I just destroyed the only person who ever believed in me. For the first time, Nora saw the truth. Not justification, but collapse. Back at the hospital, Harold was transferred to a private recovery room. Mason Caldwell came in with fresh test results, his thick glasses sliding down his nose. Your vitals are holding steady, he said. Ribs are healing, though you're too damn stubborn to rest. Harold grinned faintly. You sound like Clara. That's because she's right, Mason said, crossing his arms. You've cheated death twice, don't make it a habit. Then, lowering his voice, Nora says Evan might cooperate. They'll let you see him if you want. Harold was silent for a long moment, the air between them heavy. Do you think forgiveness fixes a man? Mason sighed. Sometimes it's not about fixing, it's about freeing. That afternoon, Harold asked to be wheeled to the chapel. The small room was quiet except for the hum of an old radiator. Stained glass cast shards of red and gold across the floor. Scout padded behind him, lying down near the pew. Clara joined him, her cane tapping softly on the tile. You shouldn't be out of bed, she said, sitting beside him. If I stay in bed, I'll start thinking too much, he answered. They sat in silence for a while. Then Harold spoke. You think God forgives men like me? Clara looked at him, puzzled. You didn't sin, Harold. No, he said softly. But I raised one who did. His eyes glistened. And maybe I could have stopped it. Clara reached over, her hand finding his. You gave him life, Harold. The rest was his to choose. That night, Nora returned with a quiet knock. He wants to see you, she said simply. Clara hesitated but nodded. Within the hour, Harold was brought to the visitors' wing of the jail. The snow outside had thickened, muffling the world in white. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh, revealing every line, every scar, every regret. Evan sat behind the glass, head bowed. When he looked up, his eyes were red but clear of denial. Dad, he whispered. Harold studied him. The same strong jaw, the same restless energy he'd once admired. But beneath it all was a boy again. Lost. Why? Harold asked quietly. Evan swallowed hard. I thought, if I could just end your control, I'd finally be free. But I wasn't chained to you. I was chained to my own hate. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the hum of the heater filled the space. Finally, Harold said, You hurt me, son. More than the war, more than losing your mother. But I won't let hate win twice. His eyes softened. I'll forgive you. Evan's breath caught. He pressed his forehead against the glass. I don't deserve that. Harold smiled faintly. Neither did I deserve to live that night, but someone, or something, thought I should. His gaze shifted slightly. Scout never left. Neither will I. When Harold returned to the hospital later, Clara was waiting by the elevator. You saw him? She asked. Yes. And? He'll serve his time, Harold said quietly. But maybe this way, we both start healing. Scout leaned against Harold's leg, his warm body grounding him in the quiet that followed. Outside, the snow had stopped. The night sky was clear, the stars cold and sharp above the valley. Harold watched them through the window of his room and whispered, We're still here, old boy. Scout rested his head on his lap, tail thumping softly. The snow outside Helena softened the world into silence. Days had passed since Harold Bennett's visit to the county jail, and in that short time, everything in his world had changed. Forgiveness, once a word too heavy to lift, had become a quiet rhythm in his chest. His recovery was slow, but steady, his mind sharper than his body, and his heart scarred yet unbroken. From the window of his rehabilitation center, he could see the Bitterroot Mountains glistening under morning light, their peaks like distant memories, beautiful and unreachable. Scout sat beside him, chin resting on Harold's lap, tail flicking lazily as if he too was learning how to rest. The hospital's rehabilitation wing was quieter than most. It smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, and the sound of rolling wheelchairs echoed down polished floors. It was here that Harold met Lydia Ramos, a physical therapist in her mid-40s. Lydia was a tall woman with olive-toned skin, long dark hair tied in a low ponytail, and eyes that radiated patience. Years of working with veterans had given her both empathy and strength. Her voice was firm but kind, her movements deliberate. She had grown up the daughter of a miner and a nurse, learning early that compassion wasn't softness, it was endurance. You've got a stubborn streak, Mr. Bennett, she teased one morning as Harold resisted her instruction to lift his arm. Runs in the bloodline, he replied, smirking. Scout barked softly as if agreeing. Lydia laughed. Then I'll have to out-stubborn you. Each day she pushed him a little further, not cruelly, but with purpose. Pain, she told him, isn't the enemy. It's the proof you're still moving. Harold appreciated her honesty. It reminded him of Clara during the war. No sugarcoating, No pity, just truth. Clara still visited almost daily, her presence now a steady rhythm in his healing routine. She'd arrive with her usual thermos of strong coffee, a deck of cards, and that wry humor that cut through the sterility of hospital air. "You know," she said once, dealing him a hand of poker, "you and Scout are getting famous. Folks in town are still talking about the dog that saved the war hero." Harold rolled his eyes. "They leave out the part where the old fool needed saving in the first place." "Humility doesn't suit you," Clara teased. "I'll wear it just this once," he replied softly. Outside the hospital, Detective Nora Kincaid's case was drawing to an end. Evan Bennett had entered a plea of guilty to attempted murder, though his lawyer, a graying man named Martin Duval, negotiated a reduced sentence on account of mental duress and remorse. Martin, known around Helena for his calm pragmatism, had deep-set eyes that always seemed to study before he spoke. His reputation came from winning hopeless cases, not through charm, but through understanding people's weaknesses. When he spoke to the press outside the courthouse, he didn't defend Evan's actions, only acknowledged his humanity. "This is not a case of hate," he said quietly. "It's a case of despair." Nora stood in the crowd, snow melting on her coat collar, listening. There was no satisfaction in the verdict, just inevitability. She thought of Harold and Clara, of the dog that barked until help came, of all the ways people broke and healed. She looked toward the courthouse steps where Evan, in cuffs, was being led away. He looked up briefly, eyes meeting hers, and nodded. Not defiance, but acknowledgement. For Nora, that was enough. Weeks later, the first day Harold was cleared to leave the rehabilitation center, the sky was wide and blue, the kind of cold that bit gently at the skin but promised spring somewhere beyond. Lydia helped him pack the last of his belongings: flannel shirts, an old photograph of Margaret, and Scout's worn leather leash. "You did well, Harold," she said, tightening his coat. "You kept moving." He smiled. "You kept me honest." Clara was waiting at the entrance, her pickup idling, breath fogging in the air. "You ready to go home?" she asked. "Home," Harold repeated. The word felt fragile but right. Scout jumped into the back seat first, as if impatient to claim his spot. The drive through Helena was quiet, stores half covered in snow, the mountains casting long shadows on the valley. When they reached Harold's cabin, everything looked smaller, older but peaceful. The porch creaked the same. The wind chime still sang its uneven song. Inside, dust motes floated in the afternoon light like ghosts deciding whether to stay. Harold wheeled himself to the fireplace while Clara set down groceries. Scout lay beside him, head on his paws. "You know," Clara said softly, "most men wouldn't have gone to see him." Harold stared into the flames. "Most men don't carry ghosts as long as I do." She didn't respond, but her eyes softened. "You think he'll ever forgive himself?" she asked finally. "That's between him and God," Harold said. "I've done my part." He looked toward the window where snow was beginning to fall again. "Funny thing about forgiveness," he added quietly. "It doesn't make you forget. It just stops the bleeding." That evening, they sat together in the warm glow of the fire. Two old soldiers, one dog, and a silence that didn't ache anymore. Clara told stories of their unit days, the chaos, the laughter, the losses. They talked about the young medic who played harmonica between air raids, about Margaret's letters that smelled like lilac perfume, about the comrades buried in faraway lands. The night deepened, and outside the forest hummed with the sound of life returning. Branches cracking under snow, the cry of an owl, the whisper of wind over the ridge. Before bed, Harold reached down to scratch Scout's ear. "You saved me again, old friend," he said. Scout looked up with tired eyes, his muzzle flecked with gray, and gave a low, contented huff. Clara smiled from the doorway. "He's not the only one who did." Later, when the fire had dimmed to embers, Harold sat alone for a moment longer. On the mantel stood a framed photograph Lydia had given him as a farewell gift, a snapshot from the hospital. Harold in his wheelchair, Scout at his side, Clara behind them, her hand on his shoulder. Below she had written in neat cursive, "Still standing." He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "Still standing, indeed." The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet earned, not given. Harold closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he slept without dreams. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the shape of a second chance. Harold Bennett didn't find his miracle in winning the war or in walking again. He found it in forgiveness, in a loyal dog's love, and in the grace God gives when we stop clinging to hate. The same God who whispered peace to a broken soldier still whispers to every heart that's hurting, reminding us, no matter how far we fall, He can still lift us home. If this story touched your soul, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below to tell us where you're watching from, or say Amen if you believe that God still works through love, loyalty, and second chances. And don't forget to subscribe, because somewhere out there, another story is waiting. A story of faith, of healing, and of the quiet miracles God hides in everyday lives. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your days with peace.